Due to extreme prejudice, the Confederate Army never effectively applied Negroes in their military to fight the Civil War. But the Union, being largely independent of slavery, would still find themselves facing similar prejudices. Ideas accepting those known as blacks into the Union Army would become of great concern as the Civil War progressed. And not only would the Union have to fight the Confederates without, but they would also have to fight battles with some long-held beliefs from within. We'll be studying this topic from Dr. Litwack's 1979 book, Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery. It beginneth now.
When the Civil War broke out, Frederick Douglass, a black abolitionist leader and former slave, immediately called for the enlistment of slaves and free blacks into a liberating army that would carry the banner of emancipation through the South.
Look who we have popped up on the scene again. I hope you didn't think that it was over after Mr. Douglass got his freedom. Oh no. He was right back at it, helping others to get theirs as well. And he wanted to put together an army of blacks to bring more fire down to the South.
Within 30 days, Douglass believed 10,000 black soldiers could be assembled.
One black regiment alone would be, in such a war, the full equal of 2 white ones. The very fact of color in this case would be more terrible than powder and balls. The slaves would learn more as to the nature of the conflict from the presence of one such regiment than from 1,000 preachers.
Preaching can be useful depending on who's doing it and who the audience is. But at this time, Mr. Douglass is saying enough with the preaching. The enslaved need to see more men with the brown skin on the battlefield, and that's going to teach them more about the conflict than 1,000 preachers yapping their mouths. Let's keep going.
But the North was not yet prepared to endorse such a revolutionary move, any more than it could conceive of the necessity or wisdom of embracing a policy of emancipation.
They shut it down. They weren't prepared in what way? Psychologically. They still had certain inherited ideas in their mental garden, which would not allow them to move forward with Mr. Douglass's proposal.
Early conceptions of the Civil War as a white man's war with limited objectives were not the only deterrent to raising a black army. Even if black enlistment should be deemed desirable, few whites believed that black men possessed the necessary technical skills, intelligence, and courage to become effective soldiers.
You see that? Circling back to everything that we've been going over. These were purely abstract ideas about them without any concrete proof. They held this belief before the people even had a chance to prove or disprove its accuracy, right? It was just a given to be true.
If we were to arm them,
President Lincoln conceded in September 1862,
I fear that in a few weeks the arms would be in the hands of the rebels.
As if they would just willingly give up their weapons or drop them on the battlefield from fear, or easily get captured and the weapons confiscated.
No less threatening to many whites was the possibility that they were wrong and that the black man might actually prove himself in combat,
which would chip at their beliefs. And most people don't like their strongly held beliefs chipped at, whether it be about politics, religion, or prejudices. And Negroes proving themselves in the battle would do just that. And for many of the whites, they'd rather not have to face that reality. Because
if you make him the instrument by which your battles are fought, the means by which your victories are won,
an Ohio congressman warned,
you must treat him as a victor is entitled to be treated, with all decent and becoming respect.
They would have to change the way they treated them. And in the racial worldview, by default, if those called blacks rise anyway in status, it automatically means a proportionate fall for whites, automatically. Because ideas of whiteness and blackness are most effective when they have a vast gap separating the two. That's why whiteness and blackness doesn't mean nearly as much today as it meant in the 1800s, because a lot of those gaps, like legal rights, have been closed. It still has psychological effects, but even those are not as impactful as they were back then. Back then, even letting a person with brown skin join the military was understood to be an elevation in status and an encroachment on whiteness. And if he proved himself in battle, he was entitled to be respected.
The use of black troops also threatened to undermine the morale of white Union soldiers, many of whom recoiled at the thought of serving alongside black comrades.
It will raise a rebellion in the army that all the abolitionists this side of hell could not stop.
One Union soldier predicted.
The Southern people are rebels to the government, but they are white, and God never intended a to put white people down.
You hear that? Even black shooting and killing a white enemy was looked at by some as a raise in black status. That was viewed as a threat to white status, right? They understood it well back then that when blacks come up, then they go down, right? There's no way out of it. The black and white dynamic has always been intermingled together. That's why I'm suggesting that some of you remove yourself away from it, right? Why would you want your status to be dependent on another people? Especially when that status was designed to always have you on the losing end, right? Think about it. The reason that it makes sense for people of the light skin to keep identifying as white is because they have blacks to contrast themselves against and to give them a feeling of superiority. But it makes absolutely no sense for people of the rich brown skin to keep calling themselves black, unless you just like being at the bottom, where people on top of you could say that God never intended an N-word to put down white people.
The exclusion of blacks from the armed forces, like President Lincoln's reluctance to make emancipation a war objective, worked only so long as the government and Northern whites remained confident of their ability to win the war. In the aftermath of Fort Sumter, with patriotic whites rallying to the flag, there seemed little reason to doubt that the rebellion would be easily and speedily crushed. 18 months later, the expected quick victory had not materialized. The war still raged with no end in sight, and a weary, frustrated North was forced to think about a different kind of war.
They thought it would be a walk in the park just like the Confederates did, and both woke up to a rude awakening that both of these sides were willing to fight hard.
Mounting casualties, the return home of the maimed and wounded, the alarming increase in desertions, more than 100,000 away without leave at the end of 1862, and the growing difficulty in obtaining enlistments encouraged a reassessment of the military value of emancipation and black recruitment.
Now they want to reassess black recruitment. You see how that works? When pressure is applied and desperation kicks in, then all of a sudden, all the old prejudices can be put to the side, right? We have to kind of rethink the matter, right? That's how they're looking at it.
If a bobtail dog can stick a bayonet on his tail and back up against a rebel and kill him, I will take the dog and sleep with him.
A Union officer declared,
And if a nip will do the same, I'll do the same by him. I'll sleep with anything that will kill a rebel.
Although this may have been a curious kind of recognition, the argument gained increasing acceptance with every casualty list. To enlist blacks was to preserve the more valuable lives of white men. The best men of the North were dying in the swamps of the South, an officer observed, and this was a loss the nation could ill afford.
You can't replace these men, but if a nip dies, all you have to do is send out and get another one.
The same administration that had summarily rejected black volunteers at the outset of the war began in mid-1862 to consider the employment of blacks in the armed forces. The initial proposals contemplated using such troops primarily for menial labor and for garrison duty in areas deemed unfit for white men, such as the malarial regions along the Gulf of Mexico and the Mississippi River. The advantages of deploying blacks in these ways were obvious.
The blacks,
said the New York Times,
thoroughly acclimated, will be saved from the risks of the climate, while in the well-defined limit of fortifications they will be restrained from the commission of those revengeful excesses which are the bugaboos of the Southern people.
Meaning they could position the blacks in places they were supposedly less susceptible to disease, and where their actions could be more controlled and not viewed as vengeful. And this was to be done to ease the Southern mind about retaliation and violence.
In a series of articles on colored troops, a columnist for the Christian Recorder, the voice of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, seemed to share the prevailing belief that blacks were
especially adapted to service in the South
because they were less susceptible to diseases which easily felled white men. When Vicksburg surrendered, the black columnist noted, the hospitals were filled with Southern white soldiers suffering from malarial diseases and fevers,
from which colored men are almost exempt.
Citing the many advantages of black troops, he welcomed the proposal to use them to guard prisoners of war and to protect garrisons in the occupied areas. Such duty, he thought, would be especially pleasant to the emancipated slaves, enabling them
to stand guard over those who have so long abused the power they held over them.
to resolve the doubts which persisted about the military capabilities of black men. Some suggested that they first be tested in battle against the Indians.
This is wild, isn't it?
If the experiment proved successful, black troops could then be deployed for combat duty in the South. Nothing came of this proposal, and it won little favor among blacks themselves.
And here's why.
I am very doubtful whether the Negro could display his bravery as well against his co-sufferer as he could against his enemy.
Wrote Henry M. Turner, the black clergyman.
Like us,
The Indian has been
scattered and peeled.
How could blacks of all people share in a deliberate policy of racial extermination? The Indians, Turner observed,
Cherish no special hatred against my race.
and the
Scalping knife and tomahawk were not shaped nor molded to injure us.
rather than wage war on the Indians, Turner suggested that black people might well learn to emulate their bravery.
Uh-oh, what is he saying?
If we had one half of the Indian spunk, today slavery would have been among the things of the past.
Implying that blacks had no real determination or boldness to face oppression. I guess that's the result when people whip it out of you, right? But they for sure couldn't whip it out of all of them because some of them had all the spunk plus more. And that's true for some of their descendants today as well.
Whatever the merits of Turner's argument, blacks had been used to fight Indians in the past, and they would do so again in the post-war Indian Wars. But to have employed them for this purpose in 1863 must have struck some blacks as a perversion of priorities. While the president refused to alter his position on emancipation and black enlistments, the Union Navy was using contraband slaves as apprentice seamen, and the Army began to employ them extensively as laborers and officers' servants. Limited and unauthorized attempts, moreover, had been undertaken in Kansas, Louisiana, and South Carolina to arm, drill, and use black soldiers. After General Benjamin Butler overcame his initial reluctance to enlist blacks, 3 regiments made up of free colored militiamen, previously organized by Confederate authorities, and even larger numbers of freed slaves were organized in Louisiana.
Uh-oh, he's getting them together and rounding them up for war.
With unconcealed enthusiasm, General David Hunter sought to mobilize blacks in the Sea Islands of South Carolina, explaining to the War Department that he had recruited no
fugitive slaves,
but
a fine regiment of loyal persons whose late masters are fugitive rebels.
And what happened?
The Hunter Project proved short-lived, largely because the government refused to recognize or assist it in any way, and aggressive recruitment tactics had antagonized both the freedmen and many of the northern white missionaries and teachers stationed there.
It fell through, and thus the blacks were not put into the fight. Now, would it continue to be that way? Would the North remain stubborn as the Confederates did? Or would they snap to reality and get some sense in them? We shall find out as we continueth to the next. I thank you for your time. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.